Hi, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell to stay updated with new stories on our channel. The bell above the grocery store door chimed its familiar tune as Daniel Mitchell wiped down the counter for the third time that evening. The scent of fresh produce and polished wood floors filled the space that had been his family's legacy for 3 generations. At 42, Daniel found comfort in the store's rhythms, the morning deliveries, the regular customers, the quiet closing times. His life moved with the steady, predictable pace of someone who had found contentment in simplicity across town. His wife Clara would normally be preparing to leave her latest church committee meeting. For 15 years, she'd been the neighborhood's angel of mercy, organizing food drives, visiting shut-ins, leading prayer circles. People stopped Daniel on the street to tell him how lucky he was to be married to such a saint. He always agreed, though lately the words felt hollow. The clock behind the counter showed 8:45 p.m. when Daniel's phone vibrated. Clara's name flashed on the screen, her profile picture showing her smiling in the church garden, surrounded by the roses she tended every Sunday after service. "Daniel, honey?" Her voice came through, slightly breathless. "We're running late with the sanctuary decorations for the Harvest Festival." "Don't wait up. I might be another 2 hours." He glanced at the store's security monitor showing the empty parking lot. "The Johnson order needs to be ready for 6 a.m., he said, keeping his voice even. "Will you be back to help with the sorting?" There was the slightest pause. "Of course, darling. I wouldn't miss it." The line went dead. Daniel finished closing procedures with mechanical efficiency, his mind working through the inconsistencies that had been accumulating like snowflakes before an avalanche. The new password on Clara's phone, the unfamiliar perfume she'd started wearing, the way she now took her purse everywhere, even to answer the front door. He drove home through quiet streets, the autumn leaves swirling in his headlights. Their modest 2-story house stood dark except for the porch light. Clara always left burning for him. Inside, he moved through rooms filled with photographs of their life together, smiling at church picnics, holding hands at community events, standing proudly beside each other at the store's anniversary celebration. At 11:30 p.m., Daniel found himself standing in their driveway, car keys in hand. The decision felt both reckless and inevitable. He drove toward St. Michael's Church, the route so familiar he could have navigated it blindfolded. The church parking lot was empty, the building dark except for the eternal flame flickering in the sanctuary window. Daniel parked across the street, engine off. Watching the Harvest Festival decorations Clara had mentioned were nowhere to be seen. No cars, no lights in the fellowship hall, no signs of life. He waited until midnight, the cold seeping through his jacket. The only movement came from an orange tabby cat hunting through the hedges. Finally, he started the engine and drove home, the hollow feeling in his chest now filled with cold certainty. Clara arrived at 1:15 a.m., her cheeks flushed, her movements unusually animated. "You wouldn't believe the mess those decorations were in," she began, hanging her coat in the hall closet. "We had to completely reorganize the storage room Martha Johnson brought her famous apple pie, and Father James stayed to help until—" Daniel watched her from the kitchen doorway, seeing the performance with new eyes. The too bright smile, the elaborate details, the way her hands fluttered as she spoke. It was all part of a character she'd been perfecting for months. "That's nice, dear," he interrupted gently. "You must be exhausted." In their bedroom later, as Clara's breathing deepened into sleep, Daniel lay awake studying the woman he thought he knew. Moonlight through the window illuminated the gentle curve of her shoulder, the peaceful expression on her face. He remembered how she'd cried during their wedding vows, how she'd held his hand through his father's funeral, how she'd nursed him through pneumonia last winter. The next morning, Daniel left the house before dawn. He drove to an office building on the outskirts of town, where a discreet sign read, "Hayes Investigation Services." The waiting room smelled of lemon polish and old books. Robert Hayes emerged from his office, a man in his late 50s with calm eyes and a handshake that conveyed both strength and discretion. He listened without interruption as Daniel laid out his story, the investigator's gaze never wavering. When Daniel finished, Hayes leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk. "The truth rarely brings comfort, Mr. Mitchell," he said quietly. "But living without it is its own kind of prison." Daniel signed the contract with steady hands, the pen feeling like both a surrender and a declaration of war. Driving back to the grocery store, he watched the town wake up around him. Shopkeepers raising their gates, parents walking children to school, the ordinary miracle of another day beginning. He knew nothing would ever be ordinary again. The investigation had begun, and with it, the countdown to the end of his life as he knew it. Somewhere in this town he loved, among these people he trusted, his wife was living a secret life, and Daniel was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. The following days moved with the strange duality of both dragging interminably and rushing toward an inevitable conclusion. Daniel moved through his routines at the grocery store with automatic precision, stocking shelves, running registers, chatting with customers, while inside every moment felt suspended in anticipation. Each time the store phone rang, his heart clenched. Clara continued her performances of normalcy with breathtaking consistency. She packed his lunch each morning with the same care she had for 15 years, her hands steady as she arranged turkey sandwiches and carrot sticks in the plastic containers. She attended her church meetings, returning home with detailed accounts of planning committees and prayer groups. She even remembered to complain about Mrs. Henderson's notoriously dry coffee cake at the Wednesday bake sale. But Daniel now saw the subtle cracks in her performance, the way her eyes didn't quite meet his when she described her day, the new habit of placing her purse on the far side of the room during dinner, the faint scent of unfamiliar cologne that sometimes clung to her clothes when she returned home. On the fourth day, as Daniel was arranging a display of autumn squash, his personal cell phone vibrated in his pocket. Robert Hayes' number flashed on the screen. "The preliminary report is ready," the investigator said, his voice professional and neutral. "When can you come to the office?" Daniel closed the store early, citing inventory, the first lie he'd told his customers in 20 years of business. The drive to Hayes' office felt both endless and instantaneous, each traffic light a fresh torment. The investigator's office felt different this time, heavier, the air thick with unspoken truths. Hayes sat behind his desk, a simple manila folder resting between them. "I need you to understand something before we begin," Hayes said, his gaze steady. "What you're about to see will change everything. There's no going back from this." Daniel nodded, his throat too tight for words. Hayes opened the folder. The first photograph showed Clara standing in a motel parking lot Daniel recognized, the Pine Grove Inn, about 20 minutes outside town. She was laughing, her head thrown back in a way Daniel hadn't seen in years. The man beside her had his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, Thomas Miller. Daniel's breath caught. Thomas was everything Daniel wasn't. Charismatic, well-dressed, a successful real estate broker who served on the church finance committee. The man who always had a firm handshake and direct eye contact when they passed the collection plate together each Sunday. The second photo showed them entering a motel room, Thomas holding the door open with that same charming smile he used at church socials. The timestamp read 2:14 p.m., while Daniel had been helping old Mrs. Gable find her favorite brand of oatmeal. Photo after photo told the story Daniel had feared, but never truly believed Clara and Thomas having lunch at a diner 3 towns over, their hands intertwined across the table. Thomas buying flowers from a street vendor and presenting them to Clara with a theatrical bow. The two of them emerging from movie theaters, walking through parks, living a complete parallel life while Daniel stocked shelves and balanced ledgers. The most devastating image came near the end of the stack. Clara and Thomas standing beside his luxury car, locked in a passionate embrace that left no room for interpretation. Her fingers were tangled in his hair, her body arched against his in a way that spoke of long-established intimacy. Hayes allowed the silence to stretch before speaking. "This has been going on for at least 8 months," he said quietly. "They meet Tuesdays and Thursdays, sometimes Saturdays, always different locations, always careful until recently. Daniel's hands trembled as he gathered the photographs. The images blurred before his eyes, the faces of his wife and his fellow parishioner, merging into a single portrait of betrayal. "Are you certain?" he heard himself ask. The question absurd even as it left his lips. Hayes produced a final document, phone records showing hundreds of calls and texts between Clara and Thomas, many occurring late at night while she claimed to be working on church bulletins in the next room. Daniel stood abruptly, the photographs clutched in his hand. "I need to go," he managed, his voice rough. The investigator nodded. "Take your time. The evidence isn't going anywhere." The drive home passed in a blur. Daniel found himself parked in his driveway, the engine off, watching the lights glowing in the windows of the house he and Clara had bought as newlyweds. He could see her moving in the kitchen, preparing dinner as she had every night for 15 years. He picked up his phone, his fingers moving automatically to her number. When she answered, her voice was light, cheerful. "Daniel, I was just thinking about you. I'm making your favorite. Pot roast with those little potatoes you like." He closed his eyes, the normalcy of her tone like a physical blow. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "At home, silly. Where else would I be? The church committee ended early today." "I'm outside," he said, "in the driveway." The silence that followed was different from any they'd ever shared. It was thick, charged, the silence of a performance interrupted. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. "What do you mean you're outside?" "Look out the window, Clara." He watched as the kitchen curtain twitched, then fell back into place. A moment later, the front door opened and Clara emerged, her phone still pressed to her ear, her face pale in the porch light. Daniel ended the call and got out of the car. The manila folder felt heavy in his hand, a physical manifestation of the weight that had settled in his chest. "What's going on, Daniel?" she asked, her voice too high, too bright. "Why are you sitting out here in the dark?" He didn't answer, simply handed her the folder he watched as she opened it. As her eyes scanned the first photograph, as the color drained from her face. The folder slipped from her fingers, photographs scattering across the damp grass like fallen leaves. Her hand rose to her mouth, but no words came out, only a small, choked sound that might have been his name. In that moment, standing in the cool evening air with the evidence of their shattered marriage lying between them, Daniel understood that some truths, once seen, can never be unseen, and that the hardest battles aren't fought with anger, but with the quiet acceptance of what must be done next. The drive home from the investigator's office passed in a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence in the car. Clara sat perfectly still in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, the scattered photographs now neatly collected and placed back in the manila envelope between them. She hadn't spoken a word since they'd left the driveway, her face turned toward the window, watching their small town pass by as if seeing it for the last time. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Every familiar landmark, the elementary school where they'd attended parent-teacher conferences, the park where they'd picnicked on summer Sundays, the bakery where they'd bought anniversary cakes, now felt like artifacts from someone else's life. When they pulled into their driveway, Daniel turned off the engine but made no move to exit the car. The house stood before them, its windows dark except for the porch light he'd installed the summer they moved in. He could still remember Clara's delight at the antique fixture they'd found at a flea market. "Daniel," Clara began, her voice barely a whisper. "I can explain." He held up a hand, stopping her. "Don't." The single word hung in the air between them. Final and absolute inside, the house felt different. The photographs on the walls, the collection of ceramic birds on the mantel, the quilt his grandmother had made for their wedding. All of it now seemed like props in a play that had reached its final act. Daniel walked to their bedroom, Clara trailing silently behind him. He took her largest suitcase from the closet and placed it on the bed, clicking the latches open with a sound that echoed through the quiet room. 1 hour, he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Take what you need. The rest can be sorted later." Clara's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down her face as she moved through the room, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She pulled dresses from hangers, swept jewelry from her vanity, gathered shoes in armfuls, all while sobbing apologies that Daniel no longer heard. He stood in the doorway, watching as the life they'd built together was dismantled piece by piece. Each item she packed felt like the turning of a page, the closing of a chapter. When the suitcase was full, Clara turned to him, her face raw with emotion. "Where will I go?" she asked, her voice small and lost. Daniel handed her a folded piece of paper. "The Oakwood Motel takes weekly rentals. It's adequate." The finality in his tone seemed to drain the last of her hope. She nodded slowly, then turned back to the bed to zip the overstuffed suitcase. As she wheeled it down the hallway, Daniel followed at a distance. At the front door, she paused, her hand on the knob. "I never meant to hurt you," she said. Without turning around, Daniel didn't respond. He simply watched as she opened the door, as she stepped through it, as she pulled it closed behind her. The click of the latch echoed through the empty house like a gunshot. For a long time, Daniel stood in the silence, listening to the sound of Clara's car starting, the crunch of tires on gravel, the fading engine noise as she drove away from their life together. Then he moved. He went to the kitchen and retrieved the manila envelope from where he'd left it on the counter. His hands were steady now, his purpose clear. He got back in his car and drove through the dark streets, his route familiar, his destination certain. The Miller house stood in one of the newer developments, a large colonial with perfect landscaping and a 3-car garage. Light spilled from the windows, and through the front picture window, Daniel could see Thomas's wife, Eleanor, moving in the living room, arranging pillows on the sofa with the same careful attention she brought to everything. Daniel parked at the curb and sat for a moment, watching the domestic scene. He remembered the last church potluck, how Eleanor had proudly shown him the new curtain she'd made for the fellowship hall, how Thomas had stood beside her, his arm around her waist, the perfect picture of a devoted husband. Taking a deep breath, Daniel got out of the car and walked to the front door. His knock was firm, decisive. When the door opened, Thomas stood there, still in his work clothes, a glass of wine in his hand. His smile of recognition faded when he saw Daniel's expression. "Daniel, what brings you by so late?" Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he looked past Thomas to where Eleanor had appeared in the hallway, a curious expression on her face. "I need to speak with Eleanor," Daniel said, his voice calm. Thomas's smile became strained. "Now's not really a good time, Daniel. Maybe tomorrow at church." Daniel ignored him, his eyes fixed on Eleanor. "It's important," he said, extending the envelope. Eleanor approached, wiping her hands on her apron. "What is it, Daniel?" As she took the envelope, Thomas reached for it. "I'm sure whatever it is can wait." But Eleanor was already opening it, already pulling out the photographs. Daniel watched as her face went through the same transformation Clara's had. Confusion, recognition, horror. She looked from the photographs to Thomas, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You told me you were at conferences," she whispered. "You said you were working late." Thomas's face had gone pale. "Eleanor, let me explain." But Daniel was already turning away, already walking back to his car. He didn't need to hear the explanations, the excuses, the lies. He'd done what needed to be done. As he drove away, he glanced in his rearview mirror one last time. Through the still open door, he could see Eleanor standing frozen, the photographs clutched in her hand, while Thomas gestured wildly, his perfect life unraveling in the entryway of his perfect house. Daniel drove home through the quiet streets, the weight in his chest already feeling different. Lighter somehow. The truth had been set free, and now it was doing its work. Cleaning house, setting things right. When he walked back into his own house, the silence felt different too. No longer oppressive, but peaceful. The air felt cleaner, as if a poison had been purged from the walls. He went to the living room and sat in his favorite chair, looking around at the home that was now his alone. The photographs would need to be taken down, the keepsakes packed away, the spaces she had filled cleared out. But for tonight, he simply sat, listening to the quiet, feeling the truth settle around him like a blanket. The battle wasn't over. There would be lawyers, paperwork, difficult conversations. But the war, he sensed, had already been won. Somewhere across town, two other people were facing their own reckoning, their own truths. But Daniel was done with their drama, their secrets, their lies. He had his truth. And for the first time in months, that felt like enough. The first light of dawn found Daniel sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling between his hands. The house held a new kind of silence. Not the oppressive quiet of recent months, but the peaceful hush of a storm that had passed through the window. He watched the neighborhood awaken, each house holding its own stories, its own secrets. By 7 a.m., he was at the grocery store, turning the open sign with steady hands. The familiar routine of morning preparations. Grinding coffee beans, arranging fresh produce, counting the register drawer, felt like coming home to himself. Mrs. Gable arrived precisely at 7:30, as she had for 20 years, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "She's gone, then?" the old woman asked, selecting her usual banana and yogurt. Daniel met her gaze evenly. "She is." Mrs. Gable nodded slowly. "The whole town's talking. Eleanor Miller threw Thomas out last night. Made quite the scene, from what I hear." She patted his hand with papery fingers. "You're better off, dear." The morning passed in a parade of concerned faces and whispered condolences. Daniel accepted their kindness with quiet dignity, offering no details, feeding no gossip. He simply worked, the physical labor of stocking shelves and ringing up purchases a balm to his wounded spirit. Around noon, Clara's lawyer called. The conversation was brief and businesslike. Daniel referred him to his own attorney, then returned to arranging apples in precise pyramids. The legal machinery was in motion, but he found he cared little for its workings. In the weeks that followed, the town's attention shifted from scandal to sympathy. Casseroles appeared on Daniel's doorstep. Customers lingered to chat. The community that had once admired Clara now closed ranks around him. Their respect for his quiet handling of the situation, evident in every interaction he learned through the neighborhood grapevine that Clara had moved to a small apartment across town. Thomas had lost his real estate brokerage when several key clients withdrew their business. The perfect life they'd built on lies was crumbling around them, while Daniel's honest existence continued with steady purpose. One crisp autumn morning, as Daniel was sweeping the sidewalk outside the store, a familiar car pulled up. Clara emerged looking older and diminished in simple clothes he'd never seen before. She approached hesitantly, her hands twisting together. "Daniel," she began, her voice thin. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." He leaned on the broom, watching her without expression. The woman before him seemed like a stranger. The light had gone out of her eyes, the confidence he'd always admired replaced by a desperate uncertainty. "The divorce will be final next weekend," he said. "Your lawyer has the papers." Tears filled her eyes. "It didn't mean anything what Thomas and I had. It was just excitement, a distraction." Daniel shook his head slowly. "It meant everything, Clara. It meant our marriage, our trust, our life together wasn't enough for you." She looked away, defeated. "Can I ever come home?" The question hung between them, and in that moment, Daniel realized the finality of what had happened. There was no anger in his heart, only a profound certainty. "This hasn't been home for a long time," he said quietly. "Not for either of us." As she drove away, Daniel returned to his sweeping, the rhythm of the bristles against concrete steady and reassuring. The past was gone, but the future stretched before him, clean and honest. That evening, he began the process of reclaiming his space. He took down the photographs, packed away her belongings, painted over the colors she'd chosen. With each change, he felt lighter, more himself. The grocery store flourished under his renewed attention. He introduced new products, extended hours, became more involved in community events. People began stopping by just to chat, drawn by the peaceful atmosphere he cultivated. 6 months after Clara left, Daniel hosted his first solo holiday dinner, inviting elderly neighbors who had nowhere else to go, single parents struggling to make ends meet, anyone who needed a place at the table. The house filled with laughter and conversation, and for the first time in years, it truly felt like a home. He heard through customers that Clara and Thomas had tried to make a go of their relationship, but quickly discovered that forbidden romance couldn't survive the harsh light of reality. Their affair, built on secrecy and excitement, had nothing to sustain it when faced with bills, routines, and the weight of their choices. One spring afternoon, as Daniel was arranging flowers outside the store, daffodils and tulips signaling the end of winter, Mrs. Gable approached with her walker. "You know," she said, selecting a bright yellow bouquet, "that new family on Maple Street? They've started coming to our church. Nice people. The wife reminds me of you. Honest, hardworking." Daniel smiled, ringing up the purchase. "I'm glad they found us." As Mrs. Gable left, Daniel looked around his store, at the neatly stocked shelves, the friendly faces of his customers, the sunlight streaming through the front windows. He thought of Clara, of the life they'd had, of the man he'd been. The truth had cost him everything, but in return, it had given him something more valuable: himself. He was no longer the betrayed husband, the victim of someone else's choices. He was simply Daniel Mitchell, grocer, neighbor, friend. The bell above the door chimed as new customers entered, bringing with them the sounds of the living, breathing community he served. Daniel turned to greet them with a genuine smile, ready for whatever came next. Some stories end with weddings and new beginnings. His had ended with truth and a different kind of beginning, one built not on dreams, but on the solid foundation of who he really was. And that, he realized as he helped a young mother reach a box of cereal, was the best ending of all. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.